All right. Well, good evening to you or good morning, depending upon where you are. I will try to stay on after the presentation and answer as many questions as I can until I fall asleep. And at that point, I don't think I'll make it to the end. So thank you for inviting me to the summit, and I'm welcome to present some work that we're doing to advance improve methane recovery, particularly from low permeability coals in coal bed methane and coal mine areas. So we are quite ahead in producing coal bed methane to LNG. And we are also looking at trying to mitigate coal mine methane by improved drainage and improved ventilation practices along with the mining group. I'd like to recognize my co-chair, Suzanne Herder, who's with the research group in the Netherlands, TNO, and the number of postdocs and PhDs that have contributed to this presentation. So what are our research drivers at the University of Queensland? Well, we know gas is a transition fuel to get us to this net zero carbon world. We have a lot of gas in place and coals in Australia, and most of these are in prospective and contingent resources, and most are troubled with high stress condition, pressure dependent permeability behavior, and we need an effective extractive technology to really bring them to market. There's a high demand for metallurgical coal still, which means improved pre-drainage of coal mine methane for deeper low permeability coals to mitigate coal mine methane emissions, and we've done some work on that. There's also increased pressure on carbon capture and hydrogen implementation, which we are working on with our PhDs. So the objective is to counter these PDP behaviors of pressure-dependent permeability. I'll just refer to it from PDP from here on. Develop novel stimulation methods that we can use to unlock these resources. And some of these resources are in joint mining areas, so your completion methodology has to take that into account. And I think a lot of this has been looked at as well in China, and I am working with others in China through our cooperative agreements there. And Andrew and I have crossed paths at some of the conferences there in the past. So we've really worked on increasing our understanding of the problem, determining the PDP parameters from DFIT, because as you increase the pressure, you're lowering the net effective stress. And I got this concept of using Jim to really model this from Jim Ertl with the work he was doing with BP, I believe, on shales. We're also trying to work on understanding fracture compressibility, depletion effects, and fracture stress effects and depletion effects. And we're working on coordinated studies with Rick at the University of Alberta, and we're also looking at microproppant research with him there. And then we're trying to really understand sensitivity to multi-layer and anisotropy effects. And we've been publishing, as you can see, these papers related to this. Now, to increase our stimulation effectiveness, we're looking at a couple of different technologies. First off, microproppants. This was some work that was started at the University of Adelaide, and there's a number of papers on that from Kesha Vars. And it's been working, we're continuing to work there with some lab work and also at the University of Alberta. We're looking at multi-stage hydraulic fracturing from indirect wells, and I'll explain what that means, because we're trying to put the wellbore in a position where we can actually fracture the coal from underneath or from the roof or from the floor. This indirect hydraulic fracturing is really important for pre-drainage for mining, which is an area that hasn't really been looked at a lot in terms of research. But this is an area that we're spending a lot of time on. We just executed a 23-stage frac job underneath the coal, and that's being documented in this upcoming ERTEC paper at the Asia Pacific ERTEC. So the co-application of this, as well as surface to inseam wells, they drill a number of laterals in the coal prior to mining, and the fracs are going to intersect them, and I'll explain what that means. This gives us this improved stimulated reservoir volume, which is just like shales, the necessary ingredient for draining low permeability coals. So in 2020 to 2021, we increased our understanding using GEM to model the DFIT behavior. Here you see the time and the bottom hole pressure. This is the DFIT, and this is the optimal solution of what we found that fits it. And then we could history match the production after that and look at varying anisotropy ratios and multi-layer effects. Now we're discretely modeling the hydraulic fracture with LGR and quarter symmetry to try to really look at these fracture effects and eventually to look at changing the fracture properties and changing our stimulated reservoir volume around the fracture. So this gives us a little bit more control in terms of the modeling aspects. And these works are documenting a lot of the work we're doing in this area. The indirect hydraulic fracturing resulted from the inability in a case to actually drill in the coal itself. They lost the BHA and they were having difficulty drilling. And this is what a surface to inseam well looks like, where you're drilling a lateral and intersecting a vertical well. In this case, the surface to inseam was put underneath the coal, just right underneath it. And you can see here the transverse, and only one stage was put actually to frac in the coal. The other 6 stages were put below the coal. The DFITs were showing a 1D stress profile versus depth that was saying we were matching quite closely the breakdown pressure as well as the closure pressures in the coal and in the floor. So they also used a number of other diagnostics with this. We used surface deformation tilt meters, microseismic monitoring, and liquid chemical tracers. One of the things that's interesting about fracturing in coals, it was noted first by Ian Palmer many years ago, is that surface deformation tilt meters often indicate, if you put them simply to a T-shaped model, they tend to show this horizontal component and vertical component. In this case, the horizontal is probably not occurring because the fracturing pressures were all well below the overburden stress. So what we believe is happening here is a dilatant effect, and Ian Palmer first noticed this and proved it on a case that I worked with him on in 2010, and we published in JPT. And what we're seeing is a dilatancy effect that occurs mostly towards the toe and less towards the heel. The microseismic, where it does give us indications of shear events, coals historically have low microseismicity. So we're also looking at the liquid tracers. And what we found is that all of the stages completed except for one where there was over displacement. So this is a case where over displacement, there's a kind of a thought that over displacement is not bad. But if you're in an indirect fracture, if you over displace, you may lose your connection. So what we're looking at with this indirect fracturing is actually staying beneath the coal, putting the fractures up into the coal. And this is a 20-stage indirect fracture in a walloon. And this is on that case where we simulated the DFIT. So we had this one pretty well matched from both production DFIT and fracture modeling prior to putting this design in place. And from that, we can see that you can basically look at the number of stages and come up with an optimal inflection point here on number of stages versus net present value of where you want to put it and how many stages it takes to put it in place. So we're working on trying to really optimize this procedure because in many cases we can't fracture in the coal directly because it's sitting right below an aquifer. So we need to look at that carefully. In some cases we'll have to indirect frac, some cases we can directly frac. So here's some of the work that we're doing in mining, and you can see the complicated pattern of surface to inseam wells and the frac well. And you can see that there's a number of intercept wells to vertical wells connecting through. And so the pattern is along basically the mine plan. Now, this was the first case we did. We used a vertical well trial, and we did DFIT testing from Indirect on the vertical well. We're able to history match the closure stress and history match the DFIT pressures. And after the frac, we saw a pattern of intersections when we came back and mined through the fracture. So what we did was a number of drilling cases of vertical fracturing and mine backs to confirm that what we were seeing is a stimulated reservoir volume effectively around the frac. The next case, after 2 verticals, was putting the lateral in under the seam and putting in 23 stages along this lateral underneath the coal seam. And here you can see the stages, the intersection with these wells and the microseismic events around the wells. The idea is not so much to stimulate this well to be a producer, but stimulate the surface to inseam wells to better drain the stimulated reservoir volume throughout the whole panel. That way it mines easier and there's less gas. So we'll continue to work and optimize this process for mine methane drainage, as well as for coal seam gas applications. And here's the SRV that we estimated pre-frac as compared to what we saw with the microseismic. And we actually saw interceptions and pressure responses in observation wells around the panel. So they're putting this down the gate road, intercepting the surface to inseam wells. They're running parallel to the gate road. And this is the area they long walk mine with metallurgical coal. So this is the production of one of the offset wells. And you can see that the production was coming down and it would have taken this path. However, the gas after frac was going up. And the only way you could model that behavior was to put in almost a negative bottom hole flowing pressure. So this is the actual bottom hole flowing pressure. So we saw a stimulation in this well and we saw stimulation in other wells. And we're progressing a research proposal to really take this into GEM, model these fractures discretely, and look at all the history matching and try to really model this up and give an understanding of how to apply this going forward. So this is one where we're going to link GEM and Gopher together to really understand the benefits of indirect hydraulic fracturing. So what's next on our horizon? Well, right now we're looking at microproppants. This is a figure by Laubach that basically explained in coal, if you have the cleat frequency and the aperture, then you can derive a permeability. So the idea is that when you inject these microproppants, and this is permeability and this is pressure, when you go up and you raise the pressure and lower the net effective stress, you get an increase in permeability because coal is very compressible. And then if you put these microproppants in, you lose some of that permeability because you are jamming and bridging and filtering the microproppant in there. And when I talk about microproppants, I'm talking about less than 50 microns. So when you lower the net pressure, raise the net effective stress, you get an improvement relative to that. There is an optimal loading. As you can see, each time we load it, we lower and lower the permeability, and we get a lower net effective permeability increase in the end after improving it and then losing that permeability. So there is some kind of a optimal loading that you can have with the microproppant, sort of a partial monolayer effect. So we've been doing a number of papers modeling different models with this and looking at a lot of work on proppant fluid modeling and transport to understand this filtration of the proppant in the fractures. And this is what we're working with Rick on, is we'd like to take, and we're looking at some studies with the 3D printed coal that he's creating and trying to look at fracture compressibility and fracture permeability as a function of natural fracture morphologies. And what we'd like to see then is if we put the proppant in place, what is the benefit of those microproppants in the different morphologies? So what's the benefit of this? Well, if we consider an SRV around the hydraulic fracture equal to a percentage of the fracture half length, so this would be 90% of the fracture half length, then we can see that you can get a benefit or a delta NPV quite quickly once you get it over a certain threshold. At most permeabilities, it's still profitable. So the way we did this is to look at a procedure that Ayrton Ribeiro developed along with Vanessa Santiago. I think they both have presented in the past. So we're modeling this effective stimulated reservoir volume improvement with these fractures. So the next step is to combine hydraulic fracturing multi-stage with this stimulated reservoir volume between the fractures, somewhat following the enhanced fracture model that you might have seen in some other analytical models. So we are ongoing discussions with microproppant suppliers and service providers to deploy this on a well whenever we can. So we're making concrete progress on applied research with our industry partners to increase our understanding of low permeability and pressure dependent effects. We're trialing new technologies and looking at novel strategies for the coal seam gas industry and moving into new areas with coal mine methane drainage and emission reduction. We have continued support through the Center for Natural Gas Proponents and are looking at additional support through the Coal Research Project and Australian Research Council projects. The energy simulation allows us to maintain a cadre of postgraduates and postdocs to address these areas, and we're having significant industry support and opportunities. This is sort of a map of where we are. I'll leave this, you can come back and look at it later, but Suzanne is working with TNO in a lot of areas emerging with geothermal, CCUS. I'm working on really trying to model and improve our low permeability drainage. We have other ongoing projects which Andrew Garnett takes a very active role in the energy simulation program. Our proponents are here. Then in the Center for Natural Gas, we have groundwater modeling. We're looking at governmental projects in support of the government. And we're working on training sector work to try to improve our collaboration and moving into new areas as far as like ESG requirements and improve our local environmental footprints. Again, Andrew drives a lot of these things for me so that I can really focus on the technical aspects. So I'd like to again acknowledge the Center for Natural Gas, our industry members, APLNG, Aero and Santos, and NERA, who did some of the funding for our microproppants. We certainly thank CMG for GEM and Halliburton for Gopher. And we're currently trying to grow this into other areas, and you can look at our website there. So I guess at this point, I'll answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Also, thank you for staying up so late for this presentation all the way from Australia. The first question is from Dr. Iraj Ershadi from the University of Southern California. He says, thank you for the presentation. What are the negative impacts of soft coals fracturing using hard proppants? Are you modeling proppant embedment and damage?
We have been looking at elastoplastic embedment as opposed to Gaussian embedment. This is an area where we've normally considered this to be a simple Gaussian embedment. And we're finding that some of the data is showing that we may have more embedment, but we're also looking at the microproppants and their filtration and how they're being put in there and what their embedment might be. So yes, embedment is still an issue in coals, and we are trying to model that. Chris Leonardi has published a number of papers on this, and we're looking at the benefit or the negative effects on permeability.
Okay. I have a question. We're talking about soft coal. In case of harder coal where the failure mechanism could be a brittle failure, and would you have to kind of design your proppants accordingly so that this point pressure on the coal would not break it prematurely?
We had some laboratory studies with Santos looking at high volume bituminous against anthracitic coals and looking at the embedment and fines and their varying closures. And this was published in 2018 in an SPE paper from the Asia Pacific Oil and Gas Conference. And what we saw was, yes, embedment increased with size, and it also increased with the hardness of the coal. And inversely, we saw that more fines were generated with higher rank of coal than with lower rank of coal. So we saw this in the lab studies, and we could quite easily see where using a smaller ceramic proppant was preferable to sand in low concentrations. And if you're over less than a ½ pound per square foot, it's pretty much not there at the end of the process.
Okay. Another question that I have is, given the bedding planes of the coal, in fact, Dr. Giovanni Grasselli could tell you later on that it is a dominant factor in terms of dictating where the hydraulic fractures would grow in terms of orientation. Does your model currently handle the growth and orientation versus a predefined orientation as the operator may think is a transverse or longitudinal fracture?
Right now we're using gopher, which only accounts for the out-of-plane activity in a volumetric sense. We are looking at more sophisticated, fully 3D discrete models, and this is some of the work that we're looking at for some of Rick's work to populate and give us some understanding to put into the DFN. We know we have varying morphologies. One of the problems we have in Australia is that we can't just depend like North America with the face and butt cleat being or basically regular to the normal stress regimes. What we've seen was most of the fracturing and cleating was done under paleo stress conditions. So we have varying stress conditions now relative to the cleat and natural fracture structure. So we're looking at all these different morphologies with Rick to try to understand how these fractures may interact with each other, what the compressibility effects are and what the depletion effects are. Because we know as we deplete the coal, we're having permeability effects and difficulties with drilling. Rick may want to answer some more on that during his time, but I'm going to have to defer that to him on the progress we've had on that. He's been working with Dr. Leonardi on that, and they are making some progress there, but it's still a work in progress.
Wonderful. I certainly believe that what you've developed here would be useful in the EGS space in geothermal, as Australia is also looking at geothermal, especially when you're fracturing the formation, trying to get thermal energy from the ground, and it's certainly applicable as well.
And we're looking at hot, dry rocks as an area in the center part of Australia because the Cooper Basin is one of the hottest basins on Earth. So we have that benefit, and that is an ongoing area of research as well. Excellent.
Thank you. So that's, actually, there's another question from Dr. Shaghi is, what do you assume for leak-off coefficients for coals when using gopher?
All right, for that, we pretty much history match the DFIT quite closely and use that effective permeability, and we fix the porosity in gopher. So it's more or less we fine tune it with the permeability, as these are all pretty much undersaturated or mostly saturated or mostly water saturated. We don't have a lot of compressibility effects or difficulties with that. So yes, Dr. Sagi is correct. That would be a problem. But we are able to match up the jobs fairly consistently with the DFIT data.
Wonderful. Okay, that's pretty well the questions, but if there's anyone else got questions, Dr. Johnson may not be available at the end of the day for the 30-minute live Q&A session. So please feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A. We'll direct the questions to Dr. Johnson later on after the summit. Once again, thank you, Dr. Johnson.
I'll continue to hang around and answer some questions
Yes,
until
okay,
I fall asleep.
Perfect. Thank you.